Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and let me start off by thanking Brandon for the introduction and also INCOR for having invited me to this conference. I must say that I found yesterday quite a powerful day in terms of listening to the different experiences of people working in the archive. I found the evening session particularly informative, the session that dealt with the documentaries on people's experiences in Northern Ireland. Found it very harrowing. But I suppose that's the nature of the work that we do, the nature of the research that we do. There are certain stories that are difficult to listen to, but one has to listen to them in order to understand to a certain extent. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start off with a quotation from the 18th Brumaire. It's something that reminds me of when I started out in civic work way back in the 1980s in South Africa. And I want to read it slowly, just to accommodate for my accent. And I start the quote. Karl Marx says, men and women make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by them, but under circumstances directly found, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Fairly somber introduction, I have to acknowledge. Nelson Mandela says more or less the same thing, but there's a glimmer of hope towards the end of his quotation. He says that there's no easy walk to freedom anywhere, and many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountaintop of our desires. And it's in the last element of that sentence that one finds hope. He says that the work of narrating or telling stories is a difficult work. I mean, if one wishes to transpose what he says here to the work that many of us are doing, and telling the stories for the narrators is very difficult, but the more one tells it, the easier it possibly can become. And when one works through it, then at least one sees the other side and one sees some hope. And that's part of what I would want to illustrate in this presentation. Now, I'm going to start off with the formal part of the presentation, and I'm going to read, otherwise I'm going to take way too long. This year, it is 20 years exactly since the curtain was finally drawn on the system of institutionalized racism that the world knew as apartheid. For those of you who are not familiar with the world of apartheid, let me give you a few reminders, even for those who are familiar. It was a world in which South Africa was clearly divided in terms of race, when black people had absolutely virtually no rights, where black people were constricted to a very small portion of the most arid parts of the South African landscape, where parents were separated from their children to work in the cities of the white section of the population. Children were left in isolate, or at least in fairly desolate circumstances, either in rural areas or in urban ghettos. It was a world in which the chances of a black child to survive were inordinately slimmer than the chances of a white child. It was a world in which education was governed according to the racial classification that the government had imposed on people. So it was a world in which black children had a very rudimentary education, but where white children had an education that could compete with the best anywhere in the world. It was also a world in which people, in pursuit of the government's endeavors, in fact, to dominate the black sections of the population, it was a world in which detentions without trial was ordinary. It was quotidian. It happened every single day. Hundreds of thousands of people throughout the apartheid period found themselves in the invidious situation of being detained for long periods of time without them knowing when that detention was going to end. So it was also a world in which young children grew up without their parents, either because their parents were labored elsewhere in the country, far from them, or because their parents were in detention. It was also a world in which children, in fact, were not immune to the devastating actions of the state. It was a world in which children themselves were detained. It was a world in which many young children were killed as they tried to counter the harsh effects of apartheid. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, 20 years in the greater scheme of history is a very short period of time. However, there are many South Africans who today, when referring to the past, appear to convey the impression that the excesses of the apartheid order were not as dire as many South Africans remember them to have been. And that really is the difficulty of working with the Apartheid Archive, that it's very difficult for people to tell stories. It's very difficult for those who had been responsible for the hardship of many to tell their story, because they have not yet acknowledged what they had done and what the wrongs they had done. And it's also very difficult for black people to tell their stories, because their stories are not permitted. Very frequently, and this happens, I suppose I'm in a more fortunate position in the sense that I can articulate my ideas, I can hold my own in conversation. I've had a fairly okay education, but there are many people in South Africa, I mean, the levels of illiteracy are unfortunately still relatively higher, who cannot articulate their ideas, and therefore it's very difficult for them to persuade people to listen to their stories. Now, even I find it very difficult that once one speaks of the years gone by and the continuing impact on South African society, your interlocutors, you can see that glaze going over their eyes. They stop listening, and very frequently they would tell you, don't rehash the past. The past is done, and that's a very common refrain in South Africa at the moment, that the apartheid is dead, it's buried, leave it alone, don't rehash it. And it's partly because of this that it's very difficult, in fact, to get narratives for the Apartheid Archive, but I'll speak about that a bit more later during this presentation. The Apartheid Archive project departs from the assumption that it is partly because of the consistent elision or denial of the institutionalized racism of the past that we continue to fail to make sense of current expressions of racism and the re-emergence of some of the most dreadful expressions of the phenomenon that has characterized the old order. For example, in recent years, South Africa has witnessed a series of some of the vilest manifestations of racism, which must certainly reawaken in those who had lived through the dark days of the apartheid era, memories that they most probably would never have wanted to relive. Incidents such as the following, which have been reported with depressing regularity in the media in recent years, serve as reminders and ex post facto evidence of the perversions of the apartheid order. And I've got three excerpts which I took from the newspapers, one fairly recently and one from the from the first decade of the century. This is an incident which happened very recently, 2 weekends ago, and this is, for me, is emblematic and symptomatic of the South African society. I do imagine that you've read it already. It pertains to an incident of road rage. Now, it's an element that one would want to explore within the South African context, the high levels of aggression, the high levels of violence that we experience. I think South Africa is one of the more violent contexts in which one can find yourself. In any event, here we have a young man who gets irritated by a driver ahead of him, thinks that the driver is not driving properly, jumps out of his car, starts bashing the car with an axe. I still wonder where the axe came from, and then attacks the driver. And then we have two Netcare. Netcare it's like an ambulance service. Netcare 911. It's a hospital service, but the ambulance is 911. And the two white paramedics attend to the aggressor and refuse to attend to the needs of the victim. And they have very good reasons. They give good excuses for why this was the case. In any case, they were suspended apparently just before I left South Africa. There are two more harrowing narratives, and I'm going to continue reading while you might want to peruse those two excerpts. Various commentators have observed that rather than progressively becoming less pronounced, as would have been expected given the increasing maturation of the post-1994 democratic structures and processes in South Africa, racism, paradoxically, in many instances, is becoming increasingly salient and overt in contemporary society. One would have imagined that with the dismantling of formal apartheid, that people would have found each other, that incidents of blatant racism would recede. Over the last few years, I ever get the impression that these are becoming, we have these regular reports in the newspapers, and it seems one gets the impression that it's becoming increasingly harrowing, it's becoming increasingly in your face, for want of a better expression. Of course, there are much more quotidian or everyday racist processes that persistently remind us of the apartheid era, but which do not grab the imagination of the media in quite the same manner as the more dramatically sensational events that have been presented to you. These include the ongoing struggle of hundreds of thousands of impoverished black families still trying to access a life better than the one they had been or would have been relegated to by the apartheid order. For example, data released by Statistics South Africa revealed that the rate of unemployment amongst black Africans currently stands at 30.7%, compared to 19.9% and 14.6% for so-called colors, that's people of mixed race, supposedly, and Indians. So 30% for black Africans, 20% for so-called colors, and 14.6% for Indians. The rate for whites is 4.4%. So it's comparable to the rates one finds elsewhere. So we have a country that is still clearly divided in terms of race, even though people still want to argue that apartheid is done. Furthermore, government statistics reveal that only 10% of black households fall within the top income bracket in South Africa, compared to 65% of white households. Now, given South Africa's apparent self-imposed and in certain respects carefully managed amnesia about the apartheid era, as well as its manifestly neurotic blindness to the ongoing impact of past forms of institutionalized apartheid racism on interpersonal, and intergroup relationships, we believe that it is important to leave open or to reopen the doors to the past. Specifically, we believe that it is important for South African society to review, acknowledge, and deal with its past, so as to better understand and manage its present and its future. Of course, the much written about South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on which many other commissions were based, has already made a critical contribution to this process. However, as some have argued, given the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's focus on the more dramatic or salient narratives of apartheid atrocities and the fact that it thereby effectively foreclosed the possibility of an exploration of more quotidian, pervasive, and no less significant manifestations of apartheid abuse, means that much of the details of apartheid racism had not been publicly acknowledged or assessed in any systematic manner. If I could detour slightly, I mean, most of you had read about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will recognize that it was stories that were sensational, stories that gripped people, stories that shook people. It's also the stories of the politically dominant, everyone wishes to look at it. So we find the stories of the big names in South Africa, the Sisulus, the Mandelas, and so forth. There are very few stories about ordinary folk, and by ordinary I mean the non-elites, people who had eked out a miserable life under apartheid, who had survived and contributed to the transformation of South African society in fundamental ways. Their stories have been completely or largely been elided. Of course, if one looks at the work of various organizations in South Africa, one sees that there's a rebuilding and an attempt, in fact, to make those silent voices more audible to the South African community. Now, it is partly for this reason that the Apartheid Archive was initiated in 2008 and formally established in 2009. Now, I want to quickly go through the primary aims of the archive, the Apartheid Archive. One of the project's primary aims is to examine the nature and experience of racism of all South Africans, particularly those who do not ordinarily have access to the media, under the old to examine the nature of the experiences under the old apartheid order and the echoing effects on individual and group functioning in contemporary South Africa. More specifically, the project aims to explore how early experiences under the old apartheid order continue to mediate individual and group responses to the self and the other. I believe, and I'm sure that there are many who differ from me, but I believe that it is important for us to excavate some of the experiences of the past in order to understand some of the problems faced by South Africa at this point in time. If one looks at the lives of ordinary folk, I'm speaking now ordinary as opposed to the elites, one sees that in many cases, obviously the lives has changed. They've got, people can vote, they can stay anywhere they want to, but they are constrained by their material circumstances to remain in those areas where they would have been located under the old order. So there's a high degree of division between different races. when one goes beyond, looking beyond the elites, in other words, the educated, those in the professions, etc. For many, lives has changed fundamentally. Much greater opportunities, but there's a strong divide in South African society. So if you look at the township where I grew up in the Western Cape, it's called Bishop Lavers. One goes there at this point in time, one will find that the entire township is inhabited by people of color. So their lives have not changed. If one looks at the poor communities, poor white communities, one sees that fundamentally they still white. Those townships are still white. It's only the more affluent one becomes that one sees a measure of integration. But then patterns of cohabiting South Africa are quite intriguing. There's a colleague of mine, and I'm sure that Brandon remembers him. Kevin Durheim is at one of the universities in KwaZulu-Natal. He's at Pietermaritzburg. He had done some research on how people inhabit beaches on the coast. That would be the East Coast. And it's fascinating what is able to determine. He says that in the mornings, one finds large groups of white families on the beaches. And then towards mid-morning, you have an increasing number of people coming, obviously because they use public transport, people of color coming to the beaches. And we see the white people moving to the edges of the beach. And until the beach is completely back, and then the white people leave. And towards the evening, one has a shift again. And that's what happens at universities very frequently. Fortunately, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. Fortunately, in small ways, things are changing. But one finds when I've gone to the University of the Witwatersrand first time, something that completely intrigued me. The University of the Witwatersrand has a history of having opposed apartheid. There's a very liberal history. But when I looked at our students arrange themselves on the university campus, it was absolutely fascinating. So you'd find little groups of white students, little groups of so-called Indian students, little groups of African students. Even in classrooms, in lecture rooms, students would first scan the venue and then decide where they're going to sit, and they'd largely decide on the basis of race. We do not revisit the past and what had made those abhorrent acts and processes possible. It's unlikely that things are going to change organically, and that is the premise, one of the key premises of the Apartheid Archive Project. To this end, the project has set itself the objective of collecting narratives of people's experiences of racism during the apartheid period, narratives of both black and white South Africans, of representatives of elite and marginalized social categories, of racist perpetration and victimization, and of trauma and resilience. The stated objective of the project is to ultimately collect as many narratives as possible over a 10-year period from different sectors of South African society, but particularly from marginalized groups such as the poor and the still politically, socially, and economically marginalized, whose life stories are rarely incorporated into dominant historical accounts of the past, and who rarely are afforded the opportunity to publicly reflect on their past experiences, or indeed to seek recognition for their experiences and their deprivations. Ladies and gentlemen, the post-1994 period saw a blossoming of literature, interesting literature, diversity of literature in South Africa. One of my compatriots this morning, Vern, spoke of a book written by Jacob Dlamini that he's busy reading, quite fascinating. A lot of people of color have participated in the world of publication and have given us different versions of the world and different, I suppose, takes on what had happened prior to 1994. But that is where our diversity ends at the moment. As in most countries, and many popular historians who tell us, the working class, people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy, their versions are really incorporated into how we understand South Africa, how we understand our history. And I believe it's imperative, in fact, for us to understand what the everyday, the quotidian experiences of ordinary, non-elite people had been, in order for us to understand the mechanics and dynamics of intergroup relationships, also in order to understand the intrapersonal, what's happening within the individual, why do people respond in the ways that they do. Once again, I come back to a point that the one puzzling thing about South Africa is the high levels of violence, the high levels of aggression, the high levels of corruption. One can look at it on the surface and try to address it on the surface, but I believe that there's not going to be effective solutions if we do not look at what had been the origins, what had been the genesis of the various problems that we are experiencing. In effect, the Apartheid Archive Project attempts to fill the forgotten gaps interspersed between the grand narratives recorded by the TRC, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and other more formalized archiving projects. As indicated, the grand narratives have been told. We're very familiar with them, but there are other ordinary, and I'll get back to that, ordinary narratives that I think will give us some indication of why our society functions in the way that it does. The Apartheid Archive Project is explicitly based on the assumption that past intolerable experiences, if not acknowledged, will constrain the ways in which the individual or group inhabits the present. Indeed, the project is based on the assumption that past intolerable experiences, and particularly traumatogenic or trauma-inducing experiences, will inevitably reinscribe themselves in the present if they are not acknowledged and dealt with. Critically, it is hoped that the Apartheid Archive will provide a non-silencing and non-deflecting containing space in which oppressive, dehumanizing, and painful past experiences can be reappropriated in non-persecutory and, very importantly, in transformative ways. I indicated earlier that it's very difficult for South Africans to speak about the past. I mean, they would want to elide it, deny it completely. And the intention of the Apartheid Archive Project is to allow people to have a space in which they can deposit their stories, and where there won't be a reproach when they deposit their stories. They won't be told you are exaggerating, which is a common refrain in South Africa. You tell a story and you said, no, it could not have been that bad. Not in all cases. I don't want to generalize, but that is one of the leitmotifs in terms of one's interaction around these stories. Now here, the use of Bjorn's notion of containment is essential. When the Apartheid Archive was conceptualized, the intention was to create not simply a space in which memories of the past could be inscribed, but also a space which could absorb in a non-deflecting way accounts of past intolerable experiences, so as to ultimately afford individuals the internal capacity to accommodate or to own these experiences and the knowledge and feelings which accompany these. In other words, it is meant to serve as a space that makes it possible for people to make a transformative reconnection with their experiences and the world, particularly, obviously, their past experiences. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got to confess I'm a psychologist by training, so part of my presentation will include a few psychological constructs. I found the notion of Bjorn's, namely containment, to be quite useful in explaining aspects of the Apartheid Archive. I mean, part of the explanation of the construct is that very frequently when people, and we look now at this typical clinical situation, someone comes and tells a very difficult traumatic story, part of the healing and part of the coming to grips with the past is in fact allowing the person in a non-judgmental way to share that story. And we're hoping that while the Apartheid Archive is a technological terrain, that we're hoping that it will serve a function of containing, of pulling in people's stories. While people tell the story, obviously they would recreate, re-understand, reimagine what they are recounting, and in that way be able to reapprehend the experiences in a way that is constructive and generative for the future. The notion of reconnection, of course, reminds us of the critical work on narratives done by Judith Lewis Herman in the early 1990s. According to Herman, recovery from past psychologically difficult or traumatogenic experiences can be seen as occurring in relation to at least three processes. These are safety, remembrance and mourning, secondly, and lastly, reconnection. These experiential processes are oftentimes reflected in and facilitated by personal narratives, such as those collected by the Apartheid Archive. If one looks at Judith Herman's idea of safety, the Apartheid Archive endeavors to offer such a space in which stories of intolerable experiences can be recounted without judgment, without retribution. And then, of course, the person is able to remember and to mourn that experience. Some people, as Judith Herman very clearly illustrates in the book, are unable to move beyond that, and they get stuck there, and somehow that does not enable the person, obviously, to heal, and those around her or him to in fact share in that healing process. But some people are able to, and then they can reconnect with their past on their own terms. It's not something that had happened to them. Certainly something had happened, but they are reappropriating it in a way that will enable them to go on with their lives and to construct better interpersonal relationships and intergroup relationships. These experiential processes are oftentimes, given that the intention of the Apartheid Archive is to allow particularly politically, economically, and socially marginalized South Africans to tell and make public their stories, it is hoped that the archive will serve to counter the tendency that has come to characterize post-1994 South Africa of silencing people and their claims about and versions of their and South Africa's future. It is also hoped that the archive can serve as a potential space, and here I'm using Winnicott's idea, a space. Donald Winnicott is one of the psychologists who was particularly prominent during the 1950s and 60s. A space that is located between and contains both the outside and the subjective, the past and the future, and very importantly, a space that is not challenged, a space where all enunciabilities are possible. In other words, a space in which people can creatively and without judgment or reproach engage with the past, the present, the future, and relations with the self and the other against the backdrop of the past. It is largely based on the importance that we attach to the creative processes in engaging with the past that we had decided to focus on narratives rather than the typical artifacts and methodologies usually associated with archives when we conceptualized the Apartheid Archive project. We believe that narratives constitute one of the more accessible symbolic forms through which people can meaningfully and creatively engage with their experiences and the past. I better watch it. Brendan, how much time?
We only got...
Okay. Okay, I'll try to run through the rest very quickly. Okay. Important to note here is that when we conceptualized the project, we accepted that the narrative submitted to the archive would not necessarily provide accurate or objectively truthful accounts. Theoretically and methodologically, this of course does not present any significant problem, since we believe that the ultimate value of narratives, such as those contained in the Apartheid Archive, resides less in the truth claims of these narratives than it does in the reflections of the interpretations, values, positions, and recollections of experiences. These reflections, it is hoped, will offer us an array of alternative entry points into the past, in addition to the also subjective accounts of historians and other scholars. Now, I must say, ladies and gentlemen, we have had several conferences where we in fact engage with people's narratives about the past. And one of the frequently cited criticisms of the project is that, but how can we be sure that people are telling, the stories that people are narrating are true stories? Well, I mean, how can we be sure that much of what is in the history books are 100% accurate? We can't hope to triangulate and find the ultimate truth, because there is no such thing. For us, it's important that people be allowed to tell the story, because the story works for them. It's not only for the archive. The story has to be told for people themselves, and we need varied interpretation of what had been the South African history or experiences under the old order. Importantly, the project was developed with the understanding that it would create or constitute an open space, a process that would remain active as long as there is a need for it. In other words, it would not constitute the end of the past, to quote Vern Harris here in the audience. Indeed, each narrative that will be captured in the archive may be seen to constitute another beginning to engaging with the past, the present, the future, the self, and the other. Furthermore, and this is quite important, while acknowledging that narratives are often used to defend so as to maintain the status quo, and we see this increasingly happening. I mean, if we look at the narratives of the powerful, the elites, and the narratives of ordinary people, we see how the past, even by those who had suffered under the apartheid order, how the past is utilized creatively to entrench power that people had obtained post-1994, and that version becomes more dominant, and the version of ordinary folk becomes less dominant, and that keeps ordinary folk in the marginal positions that they had been relegated to, and keeps the powerful powerful. We also believe, as implied earlier, that narratives critically also have important emancipatory or liberatory potential through allowing individuals the space and means to reappropriate particularly difficult aspects of their lives in a manner that is both personally and socially transformative. And that's important for the project, ladies and gentlemen, that we want a process that helps the individual, helps groups of individuals, but in order to transform our society. The project is, or the narrative is not an end in itself. It is part of a bigger or much larger and wider processes. Now, I'm going to ad-lib for the rest of the time, because I realize if I'm going to read through this, I'm not going to get to the end of it. I'll tell you a bit about a few more things about the Apartheid Archive, and then I'll end off with a quotation, which I think is quite important. It's a quotation taken out of the work of Jacques Derrida. I think to a certain extent that the Apartheid Archive has been successful. It's been able to at least get the excitement and the interest and the commitment of a large group of academics in South Africa and in the diaspora. A number of academics, or at least a number of the participants, there are 30 researchers on the project. A number of them come from the UK, from Australia, Canada, and the US. And all of these, unlike many other research projects, because fundamentally this is also a research project, unlike other research projects, we've been able to stay together as a group for at least the last 8 years. And I think that bodes well into the future. So on that score, we've been relatively successful. At the second level, we've also been successful in the sense that we have put on the foreground the stories of ordinary folk over the period since 2008, because we've had, except for the last 2 years, we've had virtually annually a conference on the archive where we attract large numbers of people. Unfortunately, primarily academics, but we believe it's also important for academics to work with the stories in order to valorize and, I suppose, showcase the work of ordinary folk. And of course, we still need to work out ways of ensuring that ordinary South Africans have the possibility, over and above narrating their stories, be it textually or electronically, will have center stage in making sense of their stories. We've also, and once again, this is important. I know that this is one of the criticisms of the project, that it can become self-serving for academics. We are interested in it to understand our society, but our priorities might not be the same as the priorities of people who are still living in abject poverty. But we also believe, conversely, that it's important for all of us to engage with. We do not want to be part of the silencing group, the group who thinks that certain things are not important. And therefore engage with the narratives. And we've produced something like, I think, four books and 60-odd journal publications. That's important because it tells a story beyond the confines of South Africa, but potentially, as I've indicated, it can be a matter of self-interest, it can be self-serving. The difficulties of the project obviously are many. I've alluded to one of them. The first difficulty is getting the stories. It's getting people to understand that what they have to say is important, because people have been socialized to a large extent to believe that what had happened to them prior to 1994 is not all that important. Their experiences count for less. And it's very difficult, and also when they engage with people ordinarily, when one goes back to the pre-1994 era, it's as your audience shuts down. And so people have acquired the habit of not wanting to speak in order so as not to be excluded from conversation, and one would have to reverse that process to a large extent. And then, of course, the ethics of the project. The project is about us showcasing, working with, allowing ordinary people to tell the story, but we are also utilizing the stories, obviously with the permission of the people who had submitted the stories, utilizing it to understand society from our vantage point. I think there fundamentally lies an enormous problem. It is something that we have to engage with on a day-to-day basis, so we would not utilize the stories if we don't get express or explicit permission to utilize the stories. We would, as a group of researchers, together look at what we had done with the stories, if we interpret the stories through our research, and then obviously get permission of the people to publish the articles. Ladies and gentlemen, I thought initially when I was invited that, God, how am I going to get through 45 minutes of talking? It was clearly inadequate. So I'm going to conclude here, and I hope I've got this. Shucks, and I've forgotten to show you a number of the slides. With this quotation taken from Derrida: "The function of the archive is not simply to memorialize, it is also to mourn, and to mourn is to transcend that which is lost." and in for that past system of apartheid, people would not have lived in abject poverty. They might have had an education. Their kids might not have been killed in a detention, a whole lot of things. And you think of all the what-ifs, but people have to be able to, I suppose, they work towards getting beyond that sense of having lost enormously in order to continue the transformation of South African society. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your indulgence. I thank you for your patience.